as I was saying, you're all very welcome to this evening. This is the second session of the Galway Autism Partnership Intro to Autism. And the title of today's session is Support During Behaviours That Challenge. This is an area that often comes up for parents and carers, no matter if a child has been diagnosed 6 years ago, 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago, or if their child has not yet been diagnosed. Behaviour is often an area of concern. So I'd like to just say again, thank you so much to Galway City and County Library Services and the Dormant Account Funding through the Department of Rural and Community Development for making this series possible. So where to start, I suppose? Yeah, so a quick overview. We're now on week 2, and that is support during behaviours that challenge. And as I said last week, we have the support and the input of Sinead Taylor, who is a child and adolescent therapist that does a lot of work here with GAP. Sinead is fantastic. We're so lucky to work with her. She has a huge amount of experience supporting autistic and neurodiverse children, teenagers and young adults. She works with schools, she works with GAP, she works with other youth organisations, and she works with both autistic and non-autistic children and young people, as well as with parents. So Sinead also facilitates our parent and carer support group. So I always say to people, if you think you would benefit from the input of an expert with lots of experience working with neurodiverse children, Sinead is the person to talk to. And that parent and carer support group is free to join every Monday morning at 11 o'clock via Zoom. Sorry now, just admitting people. We'll crack on. So I'm not going to go over everything we looked at last week because the slides and the video is available, but I thought just to bring us up to speed and because it is relevant, I was just going to do a quick little catch up. So as we know from last week, an autistic person's brain works differently. It's not impaired and it's not broken. It's just different. And understanding that difference makes a huge difference to the people who love and support that person. That means that autistic people have a unique way of understanding and interacting with the environment around them. Naturally, this has its positives, but it also has its challenges when you exist in a world or society that's designed for non-autistic people. So we learned a little bit how autistic people think and learn and plan differently. We also know that their communication can be different. Autistic people can sometimes have delayed verbal language or can sometimes be non-verbal throughout their lifetime. Many non-speaking individuals will use pictures, signs, or apps to communicate. And even autistic people who have no problem speaking can sometimes encounter difficulty communicating with non-autistic people. It's a little bit like a language barrier, a communication barrier. We also discussed how special interests and hobbies are very important to our autistic children. Like everyone else, autistic people have their favourite topics, foods, hobbies and interests, and they are really important, bring joy, excitement, empowerment and fulfilment to their lives. And special interests are absolutely amazing. And part of that is stimming or repetitive behaviours, as it's sometimes referred to in more medical literature. So those are actions that we all do when we're excited, anxious, upset or stimulated. And we call that stimming. And we know that that helps to regulate. It's important and necessary. We're actually going to talk more about stimming in the 4th session when we will be talking about occupational therapy and sensory regulation. But we also touched upon behaviours that challenge and supporting your child when they're in distress. Not every autistic child will experience mental health challenges, but they are indeed more common for autistic people. This is an unfortunate side effect of existing in a world that can perceive you as other. Anxiety and low self-esteem can be pretty frequent in autistic people of all ages, and this can result then in behaviours that challenge. So what exactly are behaviours that challenge? So to put it very bluntly in a definition, behaviours that challenge are behaviours that occur at such frequency, intensity or duration that the physical and or emotional well-being of the person or others is at risk, or where their quality of life is affected because they will have restricted access to community facilities. So just for example, like a child picking their nose and eating the contents, that's not a behavior that challenge. It might slightly affect their social lives and their relationships, but it's a fairly common developmental step, and it happens. And alternatively, if the child is picking to the extent that they're causing tissue damage or there's a result of infection, that means that that innocent behavior can then become challenging. So there's a lot of behaviors that if they're not occurring very, very frequently or they're not very intense, they don't meet the criteria for behaviors that challenge. And it's really important to remember behaviors that challenge are not disciplinary issues. They are a sign of an unmet need or a person in distress. And if we can take one thing away from tonight's session, is that we're not looking at children that are bold, acting out, or doing it for attention. Whether you're a parent or a carer or a teacher or somebody who works and supports autistic people, I want to change the way that we think about behavior. Instead of looking at a child as being bold or misbehaving, this is a sign or a signal that somebody is in need of support. Everyone can have behaviors that challenge you, me. They are not exclusive to autistic children and adults. And as I said, they are not a sign that a child is bold, acting out, or doing it for attention. And also, behaviors that challenge give us an indication into the inner workings of a person. And they can be indicators of lots of quite serious things. So pain, an increased or reduced need for sensory stimulation, a need for social interaction, maybe somebody is bored, a need for personal space or to get away from other people, or maybe they feel like they have lack of control over an environment. A desire for something. A person can have a behavior that challenges if they want something, food, toy, their favorite YouTube clip, and they can often be signs or indicators of psychological distress. So anxiety, low mood, low self-esteem, being bullied or victimized, feeling lonely or disempowered. So again, talking about that criteria for behaviors that challenge, having an occasional tantrum, that's not anything to be worried about. That's not a behavior that challenges. But if a tantrum is occurring at such intensity or frequency that they are impeding the quality of life for the child and their family, they can then be an indicator that that child's needs are not being met and that they're in significant distress. So in these cases, a person does not need to be corrected. What they need is support. So we're going to talk today about how we can recognize behaviors that challenge for what they are and provide that support. And again, a quick note to say, I won't linger too long on this topic, but just like last week when I talked about the difference between autistic person and a person with autism, it's very, very important that we get curious about the language that we use when we talk about children and young people. I prefer to say behaviors that challenge versus challenging behaviors. You might say, what is the difference, if any? And the difference is, in a way, it's very, very minor, but I think it's important. When we talk about a behavior that challenge, it means that the behavior is challenging to other people. It's not necessarily challenging for the person who is demonstrating the behavior. In fact, sometimes it can be really effective and it gets them what they need. So our perception of that behavior is challenged. We also remember that behavior is a communication and it has a function. It's not just this problem that needs to be fixed. Another thing to remember is what is challenging for one person may not challenge another. You might have a child that sings from the morning they get up to the moment they fall asleep at night. And to you, that singing might be the most beautiful thing in the world. But to somebody who is in play school with that child, that could be very, very challenging for them. It might impede on their learning. And the behavior is challenging us, but the person is not. I think saying behaviors that challenge doesn't have the same stigma attached to it as challenging behaviors, because in my opinion, challenging behaviors is only slightly better than problem behaviors, and problem behaviors sounds very like bold behaviors. And this last point that I think is very, very important, the environment changes whether or not a behavior is considered challenging. There's no behavior that's inherently challenging. If you have a 7-year-old who likes to come home and take off their trousers and sit on the couch while they eat their popcorn and watch the TV, that's not challenging. However, if they like to take off their trousers when they're on the bus, that is a challenge, and that will impede on their quality of life and how they can engage within the community. So I'm not going to linger on that too long. I just think it's important that we get curious about our perception of behaviour throughout this time and it going into the future. And again, to kind of challenge these perceptions, I have 6 examples here of different behaviours that, depending on the intensity, the severity, the frequency, can be considered totally normal or can be quite challenging for people. So up in the top left, you have a child who is engaging in hand flapping, which is a form of stimming. So if any of your children engage in hand flapping, you'll be very, very familiar with that. So lots of different ways of hand flapping. And as we said last week, stimming is fantastic. And sometimes a child can engage at stimming to such a level that, you know, maybe they're not able to tie their shoes, maybe they're not able to finish their breakfast, maybe they're not able to put their clothes on in the morning. So striking a balance between allowing a child to stim, but also so that they can be independent and do things for themselves, that's quite important. On the bottom left, you have a ripped book ripping, or, you know, what if we were to pathologize it, we might call property destruction. If somebody's going into school and they're ripping up all the books, they're going to get flagged as having a behavior that challenges. But ripping books is a totally normal behavior for young infants. And some people really just enjoy the sensation of ripping paper. They're not doing it to act out. It's just something that they like to do. And the point of this slide today is to just kind of show we can pathologize anything when we're looking at autistic behavior, but we need to remember ourselves that we are all human. We all have behavior. If I do it, is it not a behavior that's a challenge? No, not necessarily. We just need to get realistic and pragmatic when we're talking about behaviors that challenge. This one here in the top middle, nose picking, very, very normal. Actually, a survey in 1995 showed that 91% of respondents admitted to picking their noses, and I think the other 9% were probably lying. So every child picks their nose, but if we're picking our nose too frequently, it can result in tissue damage, infection, and the spread of contagious diseases. And I think it's funny that there's an actual scientific term for nose picking, and it's called rhinotelexomania. So again, it just goes to show we can pathologize everything. Tantruming down here at the bottom, very, very common, and it's a really good communication tool. But if it's very, very frequent, it indicates that a person is in psychological distress and their needs are not being met. So when people don't have the other tools to communicate their distress, so speaking, writing, typing, or sign language, and if people don't have the ability to regulate their emotions or how they're experiencing the environment around them, they may resort to tantruming. And then things like hair pulling and nail biting. Hair pulling is considered to be very, very serious and a serious sign of anxiety or OCD, whereas nail biting is a little bit more socially acceptable. And, you know, we don't really know why these things, both of them can cause infection, tissue damage. But again, people have different opinions on these types. So again, just to make sure that we get curious about behaviors, that if our autistic child is doing it, that we don't immediately panic and go, oh no, this is something that has to be fixed. Really examine if the child is doing it, if it's functional, is it harmful, is it occurring at such an intensity that this child needs support? And then once we've asked those questions, we're not looking to fix the behavior. We're looking to support a person in distress. So when people come to me and they say, I need help with my child's behaviors that challenge, what I really hear them say is, I need help so that my child can be happy and feel safe. And a parent who is asking for help with their child's behavior are really in need of support so that they can empower their child to be healthy and happy. Behaviors that challenge, again, are not autistic behaviors. They are human behaviors and they communicate a very real need. So the good news is you have the most powerful mental health intervention at your hands. The Parent-Child Connection is the most powerful mental health intervention known to mankind. The not so good news is that's a big responsibility and it takes a lot of work. And we're going to talk through this evening what you can do as a parent and as a carer to meet the needs of your child and to give them the skills that they need so that they are happy, healthy, and regulated. So again, as I said, behaviour is the tip of the iceberg. And as parents and as adults, we need to shift our lens view so that beneath every behaviour is an unmet need or unrealistic expectation. We're not looking at a behaviour at a surface level of what we can see. In fact, in a way, distressing as it can be to have a child that is showing behaviours that challenge, it is communicating that there is something wrong. It's better than a child internalizing all of that distress and trauma and, you know, keeping it to themselves. Whereas the child is actually giving us physical signs and symptoms that they're in distress and they are asking for help without using the words. We need to be able to look through the behaviour to see the feeling behind it. And why do we look through behaviours? Well, first and foremost, it's the most effective way to support a child or a young person with behaviours that challenge. When we view behaviours comprehensively and in a holistic brain and body paradigm, we will come to understand the difference between emphasising behavioural compliance and building the capacity for emotional regulation that underlies behavioural control. What does that actually mean? So when we look at behaviour as the visual, physical symptom of something going on in the mind, in the body of the child, then we will understand that we don't need to teach this child to be compliant, to sit still, to be quiet. We need to teach this child the skills and the strategies that they need to be able to do to regulate their own emotions. So I have a big issue with teaching compliance. I'm totally against it because when I hear teaching compliance, I hear that we're teaching our young people to be quiet and say yes. And I think we have a history in this country of being seen but not heard. And we all know that that did not end well for our young people, that a great disservice was done to children and young people across the world as well. You know, if we are teaching children compliance, we are not teaching them to protect themselves. We are not teaching them to be autonomous with their mind, with their body, with their soul. I am a big believer in teaching children how to regulate their emotion so that they can process what they're going through. So I said we would talk a little bit about the neuropsychology of the brain, and I want to put everyone at ease. You don't need to remember this the next time you go and talk to your child. You don't need to remember the parts of the brain. It's just helpful for getting a deeper understanding about why some people do things the way that they do. So when a child is born, as you will know, in order to fit through the birth canal, a child is actually very, very underdeveloped. If you've ever seen these nature documentaries with these little turtles that come out of the eggs on the beach and they go straight into the water with no parents beside them, nobody to show them what to do, they just do it straight away. Or if you see a giraffe being born and within 10 minutes, they're suddenly standing up and walking and running. Humans don't have that. Humans are born with a very, very large brain, but it's nowhere near large and developed enough to be able to do all the things that we need to do to function as a human. So when a baby is born, their brain is still very much developing. Spoiler, it does not stop developing until a person is 25 years of age. So there really is a difference between teenagers and young adults and older adults in terms of brain development, impulsivity, things like that. You know, it's not just this myth that people make up just for the crack to make teenagers feel bad. So the brain is constantly developing, and it develops from a kind of an inside out approach. And what I mean by that is the first part of the brain to develop the quickest is here at the back, your brain stem. That's the most primitive area of your brain. And that is where you process temperature, things that your body does without you even thinking about it, and sensory feelings. And then a little bit up and out from that is the limbic and midbrain areas, where things get a bit more complicated, such as in our attachment, how we regulate emotion. And then the prefrontal cortex and the cortical brain, which is at the front and all out on the surrounds of the brain. That is where you get the advanced stuff like cognition, self-esteem, things like that. And that's important to know, because when a child, an infant or a toddler, is going about their daily lives, they do not have the ability, they do not have the language to process what's going on around them when it's a traumatic thing. And when I say traumatic, I don't mean things like a car crash or a dog bite. I mean things like a sensory environment that is really, really scary. I mean things like loud noises. So infants and toddlers have not yet developed language that makes sense of their experience, and therefore all their memories are sensory memories. And the baby operates out of the brain stem. So this part of the brain, which is very primitive and very, very much geared towards basic functions and survival. That's the first part of the brain to develop. And it's that way so we stay alive. So therefore, memories before language are known as implicit. And that means that the child cannot recall them, but their body has stored the memories in its sensory system. And this is actually an example of this is when children have an aversion or a fear of loud noises. When they were a baby, they were probably exposed to just the general, day-to-day doors banging, car horns, people shouting, television, music, and they may have felt fear and their body felt in danger. And now later in life, when they're 6, 7, 8, or 9, they have this fear of loud, sudden noises. They don't know why. They can't rationalize it. They can't talk about it, but it's there. And what that does is when their ears hear a loud noise, and an example that we get a lot is babies crying or hand dryers in bathrooms. So if they hear a baby crying, immediately, before they can even think about it, before they can even process it rationally, their body, the brain stem back here, has triggered a survival reaction. So their body has gone from, or their brain has gone from being functional and doing the things that it needs to do to complete survival mode, where only the basics matter and they have to get out of that situation as quick as they can so they be safe. And the brain is really, really good at doing this, whether you're a kid or an adult, or whatever you are. The brain is great at keeping you safe, but sometimes it's too good. And sometimes it interprets things that are actually perfectly safe, such as a hand dryer in a bathroom or a baby crying, and it makes you feel like you are under attack. So if you have a child that seems to react to things that you would actually be like, what's the big deal? You're safe. This is fine. Nothing's wrong. It could be something got to do with these implicit memories and that brainstem development where they're kicking into survival mode. And again, a little bit about our nervous system. Our nervous system is hugely integrated into how we regulate our emotions and how we interact with the world around us. So on this, we have the autonomic nervous system as a ladder. So right here at the top, the ventral vagal activation. That's a part of the brain. You don't need to remember that. What you need to know is when your child is regulated, they're feeling at ease, they can manage whatever comes their way, they feel empowered and connected, they can see the big picture and connect to the world and people in it. And when a child's ventral vagal brain is activated, they feel safe, social, and engaged. So a couple of rungs down the ladder there, we have the sympathetic activation. And when a child feels like that, they're getting overwhelmed, having a hard time keeping up. They feel anxious and irritated. The world seems dangerous, chaotic, and unfriendly. So at that point, they could be mobilized, agitated, frantic. If you imagine a child that kind of starts, like shouting, or is every time somebody comes near to them that they push them away, or they even run away, they want to get away from other people, they are very snappy, irritable, they are then in the middle of sympathetic activation. And, this isn't the end of the world. We can work with sympathetic activation. There's a lot that we can do to help a child at that moment. What's really worrying is when they go into dorsal vagal activation. So they feel buried under a huge load and they can't get out. They're alone in their despair. Their world is empty, dead, and dark. And at that point, the child or the person has shut down, they're numb, they're collapsed. And ironically enough, in classrooms in particular, children that are numb and shut down, they're not the children that are getting the SNA support or the resource hours, because they're quiet, they're compliant, they follow the rules, they don't make a fuss, and yet they come home and say things about how, they hate their life, they never want to go to school again, they're so unhappy. These are the children that are really in need of connection and support. So what do these things actually look like? So when your child has that sympathetic response, there's 4 survival strategies. There's fight, flight, freeze, and collapse. We're going to talk about them in a bit more detail. And you can see here, I won't spend too much time on this, but I will send you out these slides so you can access this at any time. If you see any of these traits in your child, you know that they are having that sympathetic response. This middle column is what we want to see. This is the state at which your child is happy, content, and can learn. This is the sweet spot that we all want to be at all the time, because we do our best when we are conscious and happy and in control. So again, you'll see what these look like. If you see these in your child, you know everything's going good. Now, these are our collapse state. So helplessness, lifeless, very, very tired, low mood, and things like that. So, sorry now. So just going on to the next slide again, I'm not going to keep too long on this, but this will be of interest to all of you. So take your time in looking at this. Here is a menu of little activities that you can do with your children once you've identified what state they are in to help them regulate. And you don't need to make it, all about mental health or behavior. Just work it into your day as part of a game or when you're sitting at the breakfast table. So physical activity is really, really great for children if they're in that state of collapse, jumping, running, crashing, bouncing on a yoga ball. For a child that's in a heightened state, so fight, flight, or freeze, things like deep pressure on arms. If your child likes it and you have the time, taking a bath or a shower, they can be great. Wrapping up in a snuggly blanket, singing. So things that you're doing already throughout the day that are just a part of having a child, but knowing that these can be really, really useful tools to help you to regulate your child. You'll see that nothing on this is complicated. You don't need to be a qualified psychologist or counselor to do any of these activities. It's just about recognizing when the child will benefit from these most. So why does the child who is seemingly having a great day, nothing's gone wrong, why do they have a meltdown when you give them their cereal in the wrong bowl? This is all about the window of tolerance. And we have it here displayed in the beautiful rainbow form. Our window of tolerance, this is something that everybody has. We all have a window of tolerance. And right here in the middle, you'll see optimal functioning. That's where the growth happens. That's the sweet spot where we can learn, be social, we can improve ourselves, we can try new things without fear of failure. On one side of the window of tolerance, we have the shutdown, the collapse. On the other side, we have that agitated state. In either of those sides, we are not able to be the person that we want to be. We're experiencing heightened anxiety, we have difficulty focusing, we just can't regulate, and we can't hear what's being said to us, we can't learn. A regulated nervous system, so this is the healthy nervous system, can shift from high arousal or low arousal into that optimal functioning and then experience states of joy and contentment. A child who has experienced traumatic experiences has a small window of tolerance. And when I say traumatic, we need to move away from this idea of trauma as being something like PTSD, World War II, car accident. Trauma can be growing up in a world where you don't understand the social cues of what's expected to you and you find it harder to fit in a play school than everyone else. That can be traumatic. And adults have this window of tolerance too, but children's is more vulnerable. It's generally more narrow as they learn to regulate themselves and navigate the world. And their brain is also more malleable and developing. So how do we widen the window of tolerance? That's what we want. We want a wider window of tolerance. We need rhythmic, patterned, repetitive actions to help regulate. I have seen and worked with children whose window of tolerance is so small that they can't hear the word no. And other people might interpret that as a bad behavior. But to me, this child is in such a heightened state of anxiety and so distressed that when they hear this word, it triggers this animalistic, mind frame. They suddenly lose their ability to regulate and they will start acting aggressively. And, you might know what your child's window of tolerance will be. You'll know by being around them. But this is, again, a good explainer as to why some of the things that we think are really, really like not a big deal and worth getting upset over, why children can get very upset over these things. So you'll see in this graph, a healthy nervous system means that a child can experience disruption or, unpleasant experiences, but they stay within that normal range of nervous system activation. And an unhealthy nervous system or a dysregulated nervous system, an event will happen, it's traumatic for the child. They will fly up into being very, very agitated, into a high state of activation, or else they will drop down into that state of collapse and they stay in it much longer. It's harder for them to get out of. So we want our children, we want our family to have a healthy nervous system. We want that healthy nervous system so that we can cope with, the terrible things that happen during a pandemic or even before a pandemic, and we can get on with our daily lives, So what can we do to help? We're going to talk about that now. So enough about neuropsychology and how your brain and your nervous system works. As I said, you don't need to remember that when you are interacting or communicating with your child, but it's nice to know the basis of what we're learning. And it gives us a little bit, like I said, it's that lens shift. So we have a different perspective. What can we do to help? We'll use a strengths-based approach. We're going to talk about the 3 R's: regulate, relate, and reason. We're going to discuss attunement and how important that is, understanding our child's survival mode and matching the strategy to the survival mode. We're going to talk a little bit about grounding techniques, and then finally self-care and compassion. So I'm just going to ask for a little bit of interaction now. So in the comment section, if you can see it, I can't. Yeah, now I can see it. If you can see in the comment section, I'm just going to briefly stop the share. So I want you to describe a donut in very, very simple terms. Write down what you think of when you think of a donut. So tasty, very good. Okay, round with a hole in the middle, sweet. Deep fried iced pastry, okay, tasty, yes, yum, yum. Sweet, excellent. Round hole in the middle, very good, okay. Sprinkles, brilliant, okay. Lots of different words, soft, nice. Round sugary icing, a sweet pastry with a hole, very, very good. Filled or plain, great. Okay, your donut experts, that's always good. Round baked good, oh, I have to go back to say round baked good, sometimes with cream or jam on the outside, often with topping and on a top or outer layer. That person is actually must work in like the donut industry, because that's the best description of a donut that I've ever heard. So you can stop describing donuts, okay? The purpose of that is just, and actually I have to say, you guys are all experts, because the reason I asked you to do that is focus on the donut, not the piece we perceive to be missing. When you ask people to describe a donut, a lot of them will just say, it has a hole in the middle, that's it. They're not talking about the delicious filling. They're not talking about the sprinkles. They're not talking about the soft pastry, all the mouth-watering bits. A lot of people focus on the whole, the piece that we perceive to be missing. But don't, when you're talking about your child, whether it's with a friend, a family member, a professional, don't focus on the negative. don't focus on what people perceive to be lacking. Look at the ability, look at the strengths. Not only will this have better outcomes for you and your child, how people view your child and how they treat them will be totally different as well. Focus on the relationship and the child's strengths and move away from focusing on the behaviours that challenge. Use a strengths-based approach. I always say another thing is you have to be a cheerleader for your child. So even if they're going into creche and taking everyone's toys, well, they have the most beautiful singing voice. Or if they are going into school and getting into a fight with the teacher every single day, they love reading. That is their strength. And if we work through a child's strengths, we can find the route into helping them with the things that is really challenging to them. And like, you know, it sounds more complicated than it is, but an autistic teenager may have difficulties with, let's just say, they may not particularly enjoy school. They might not like English, they might not like reading, but they might love history. So a person who loves history will be motivated to learn, to research, to write their own academic papers. And when you see people who are in academic positions or working in really niche areas, they have focused on what they're passionate about. And despite the challenges along the way, they have achieved massive amounts. Totally unrelated to the presentation today, but we actually had a young man who was a graduate of animation who approached us and he said, I'm autistic. I'm finding it really, really difficult to get into the animation world. It's a hard work environment to crack. I'd like to do some volunteering with GAP. And we were like, that's great. And he did. And he volunteered and he facilitated an animation group for teenagers. And I was hearing these rave reviews about how this group was fantastic and they loved it and they kept coming back and they wanted more. And I would say to the young man, I said, you are fantastic at this. Like, you're brilliant. Have you ever thought about youth work? And he was like, no, I just really love animation and so do they. And I got an email right before Christmas just to tell me he has gotten a job with an Irish animation studio. So I think it's important to share those moments of happiness and joy. I know you'll appreciate it as much as I do, particularly when it's a tough month and we're going through a lot. So that's a great example of using that strengths-based approach. That young man didn't particularly think I'm the best youth leader or youth worker. He just really liked animation and he could share that passion with other people. So the 3 R's. And that's how we reach the learning brain for the child. We get the child social and learning. First, we regulate. We help the child to regulate and we calm their fight, flight, freeze, or collapse response. So we're bringing them back online. And Sinead uses a great little visual trick for children. And they could be 3 or 4, you could teach them this. She says, this is our brain. The front part of our brain is the thinking brain. And the back of our brain is our lizard brain. And the lizard brain is the brain that gets scared or angry or anxious or worried. And when we're happy, the thinking brain is in control. But when we're scared or anxious or worried, we flip our lids. We can't think straight anymore. And the lizard brain is in control. And we end up doing things that we regret and that we don't like to do, like tearing our book or pushing our brother or something like that. So we need to help a child get their thinking brain back online. And you can teach children that. I'll share resources on methods to teach kids that, but you'll notice it's working when they start talking about you flipping your lid and saying like, Mom or Dad, you just flipped your lid there, and they start using it against you. And at that point, the teacher has become the student. You know you've done a good job then. So relating to one another, relate and connect with the child through an attuned relationship. I'll explain what an attuned relationship is in a minute, but it basically means understanding your child's needs and their feelings. And then when the child has calmed and when their thinking brain has come back online, then we can reason. That's the point at which we can support the child to reflect, learn, articulate, and become self-confident. As a rule of thumb, never try to reason or reflect when a child is in a heightened state of distress. you literally may as well be talking to the wall. The child's brain cannot learn in that state. They just can't. And it's the same if a child is in school and they're living in terror. Maybe they're scared of another student, or they're scared of a teacher, or they're just scared of the environment. They cannot learn. They might be able to sit still, but they're not able to learn. So when a child is calm, regulated, and grounded, they're in control and they're able to learn. And with practice, these coping skills become very automatic. We become responsive rather than reactive. So instead of flipping our lids, we can actually think through what's going on. And then healthy, reflective communication becomes the norm with practice. So we co-regulate to regulate. So infants and children gain the ability to manage their own emotions by being soothed by parents and caregivers. You're literally doing your job every time you hold your child and comfort them. They need that. There is no other way to learn how to regulate than without somebody modeling for them and co-regulating. Unfortunately, you can't hand them a book or show them a YouTube video. They can't learn that way. They need to learn by you co-regulating. And how do we start to do that? We become aware of our own emotions. We name the feeling out loud and we model the appropriate reaction, and we repeat and repeat and repeat. So just for example, say you get home from a stressful COVID-19 era shopping trip and you realize that you forgot to pick up milk. You're angry, you're frustrated, and you're scared. There's a pandemic out there. You're at risk of infection. You slam the fridge door and you start cursing, and you are now modeling a meltdown or a tantrum. If you get back, you realize you forgot the milk, and you say to yourself out loud in front of the child, I am really frustrated and I'm cross with myself that I forgot that milk. And then take some deep breaths before looking at the solutions. I'll get some from the corner shop. I'll pick it up the next time. We can use soya milk instead. You're then modeling that healthy coping. You have to repeat it again and again, but it works for the child. What is attunement, like I mentioned earlier? It's when we're aware of and responsive to another and recognizing how a child feels. Are they happy, sad, interested, engaged, capable of listening? Or are they in distress, hungry, or do they need to be held? So when we know and when we have attunement with our child, we will then engage, encourage, and show them feelings of love and care. Children are attuned to us as well. They can recognize when we're upset in a high state of distress. And attunement is great in one way because it allows you to co-regulate, but it's also a big responsibility because children are so attuned to our moods. And you know, when you see a child and a parent, and you know, it's nearly like they are, you know, best friends and they get each other. That is attunement. So the next few slides are all about these 4 survival strategies. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on these either. I can answer questions on these, but I'm going to leave them in the slides for you so you can go back and look at it and see which of these you regulate as your child, what's their survival strategy. And a child doesn't have one survival strategy. They might have all 4 at different points during the day. So we have fight, flight, freeze, and collapse. They might have 2 of these within a 5-minute space, but it's about recognizing what they are doing and what the survival strategy is. So fight looks like what it sounds like. It's, you know, being aggressive, you know, shouting, property destruction, pushing people away. So what you can do to regulate is get the child to do some deep breathing, try some chewy foods, get them to do a little bit of movement like swinging, or linear movements is what they're called, swinging, hanging, hot chocolate, a weighted blanket and a cuddle. Give them an important task that you know that they can do. Create a space where they feel safe. So if your child is playing with another child and they're getting all hot and bothered and they start pushing them away, giving them a little space where they can sit down, read a book is really important, and tell the child that they're safe. Flight, again, sounds like what it is. Literally running away. So on the playground, running away, fleeing, trying to get away from the problem. But it can also be just these avoidant behaviors, like being hyperactive, silly, loud, and disruptive. not being able to cope with free play or unstructured times. So what can help when a child is in flight mode? Keep them close by, try that deep breathing, remind them that they're safe, give them an easy task, something that they're really confident with. Give them some crunchy foods to kind of stimulate the brain and get them back thinking. Again, create a safe space for them. If they do want to run away and hide, let them hide somewhere they're going to be safe. The hot chocolate exercise, that's a lovely little breathing exercise that you can teach with your children. And I will link to that as well in more detail. Freeze mode. Freeze is when a child is bored, not interested, distracted, staring into space. Literally just like, you know, they're no longer online with you. They're not the present anymore. They can be clumsy, forgetful. You might ask them to do something and they didn't hear or they didn't process what you're saying. What you can do to help them is stay with them and ask them really gentle questions like, where are you gone? Do you want to come back to me and help me with, you know, the dinner? Do you want to help me unload the shopping out of the car? Do you want to bring the dog for a walk? So ask them to come back to you in a really gentle, welcoming way. Tell them that they're safe. Have grounding objects, so favorite toys, books, blankets. Deep breathing is across all of these things is really effective. You know, spinning on a swing, movement, jumping on a trampoline is brilliant. So if the child is kind of in a frozen mood, you can't move and be frozen at the same time. It takes away from the brainstem back here and brings them back online because they are no longer thinking about being frozen. They are thinking about jumping on a trampoline. And even like that soft touch, even if you're just walking past them when they're playing, just a little soft touch on the shoulder to show that you're there. And then collapse, the one that we worry about the most. So unhappy, low mood, alone, withdrawn, never asking questions, doesn't want to answer questions, never draws unnecessary attention to themselves, quiet, compliant, and easily bullied. So tragically, the kids that are missed most at school but are in most need of support. What helps a child when they're in collapse? Shoulder pads, weights, things like that, giving them small repetitive tasks, telling them that they're safe and spending some quiet time together, maybe reading a book, deep breathing, swinging, lots of empathy and grounding activities. And there are loads more of these tips and techniques. It's all about identifying what works for you and your child and being able to recognize when they're in a different survival mode. So we're going to practice the most simple, super simple exercise that we can do as a co-regulator and also for ourselves. This is something that's super easy to remember. You can start teaching it with children as young as 2, if not younger, and it's called box breathing. A lot of you are probably familiar with box breathing. This is good for you and good for your child, and this will start you off on the path to co-regulation. So you can take part if you want to, you don't have to, but you can sit up in your chair a little bit straighter, not too straight, but gently straight in the back just to allow the breathing to be a bit more easier. You can close your eyes if you want to. And what we're going to do is breathe in for the count of 4, hold that for 4, breathe out for 4, and hold for 4. So we'll try that now. So breathe in for 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold for 2, 3, 4. Breathe out for 2, 3, 4, and hold for 2, 3, 4. So it's called box breathing because it's 4, 4, and 4. Very easy to remember. And the idea is that you might repeat that 6 times, 8 times, 10 times, however long it takes for you to ground yourself or to ground the child that you're with. And if you're like me and you find it hard to count to 4 and breathe at the same time, which I honestly do, and this talk about brain developing at the age of 25, I'm still waiting for the ability to be able to multitask. I cannot breathe and count at the same time. There are YouTube videos, there are apps that will do the counting for you to make it as easy as possible. So that's something you can get kid-friendly YouTube videos as well, so you can learn it together. So try that at home. Try and teach it when your child is happy and regulated. Teach it, teach it, teach it, and then it will be there for you when you really need it, when your child is in distress. And last but not least, it's very important that as a parent or a carer, we're taking care of ourselves. In order to develop your capacity to feel and attune, it's important to spend time with your own body and be able to recognize your own feelings and emotions and how you react and respond to stressors. So it's important that you understand your triggers, our sensations and feelings that arise during the day. As adults, we need to start getting curious about what we do and start to notice how we respond or react. You know, if something like going on social media puts you in a bad mood or makes you very anxious, we need to start getting curious about why that might be and what you can do to make things better for yourself. You must trust and listen to your body because your children are watching and listening. And it's a cliche for a reason. You can't pour from an empty cup. Take care of yourself first. That is a very difficult lesson for parents to learn. And particularly in the time that we're living in now, it seems hard to ask for help and it seems even harder to get help. But the small things that you can do to take care of yourself, whether it's a short walk, eating healthy, grounding techniques, talking to a friend, these will replenish your levels for co-regulation and attunement. And the best thing that you can do for your child is to take good care of yourself. It's not selfish, it's not self-indulgent. If we're Irish in this chat, we've been fed that myth that it's not good to take care of ourselves, but it absolutely is. It'll make you the best possible parent and carer that you can be. So these are just some of the references for some of the more clinical stuff that we discussed. And I'd like to thank you all so much for that. As I said, we'll have a bit of time. I'm sorry I went a bit over time, but I'll stay on as long as you have questions. And just next week, again, we'll be talking about communication. I've developed this information session with Sabrina Brown, who's a speech and language therapist. We're going to cover what is speech and language therapy, what does a speech and language therapist actually do, what questions should a parent ask an SLT, and simple, easy to practice SLT strategies to encourage language and communication at home. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. And again, same as last week, if you have any questions, please just pop them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them, okay? Now,